All right, welcome back to our next section in the Gospel of Mark study. We are looking today at Mark chapter 15, verses 21 to 41, under the major heading of Passion. And here we are looking at the crucifixion and death of Jesus. Looking first at Mark 15, verses 21 to 24, we see Jesus moving towards the crucifixion. Jesus starts carrying his cross. We know that from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 20. But along the way, he stumbles, and Simon of Cyrene is enlisted to carry the cross for him. Um, Mark states that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus, and Mark notes this likely because he was known to the believers in Rome, and it could possibly be the Rufus mentioned in Romans 16, verse 13 by Paul. Why did Jesus struggle to carry the cross? And when they say that Jesus carried the cross, it was likely the cross beam, which was kind of the normal protocol for crucifixion. The upright beam would already be standing, and the prisoner was required to carry the cross beam. They estimated the weight of that beam to be about 30 to 40 pounds, so heavy but not excessive. But the thing is, we have to remember that Jesus was flogged, a detail that we didn't spend much time focusing on last week. But flogging in Rome was a very gruesome punishment. Uh, the whips were not just made out of leather, but they had woven in them bits of bone or rock, and they were designed not only to lash the victim, but to tear the victim's skin open. In fact, there are stories and accounts that sometimes when the Romans would flog their prisoners, that their intestines would become exposed, but certainly it would go through the skin and into the muscle. And so that added to the fact that the soldiers abused Jesus and punched him and hit him with a stick and put a crown of thorns on him, was such a brutal punishment that he was no longer able to carry out this task. Um, in contrast to that, however, when the soldiers offered him wine and myrrh, which would have been a painkiller designed to kind of be a little bit of grace to the crucifixion victims, Jesus refused. He wanted to bear in soundness of mind and as much clarity as possible the work that he was doing. While Jesus was being crucified, the first thing they do is strip him down. Normally, the victim would have been crucified completely naked. We do not know whether or not they took into account Jewish sensibilities and left Jesus with a loincloth, but otherwise he was most certainly naked. And this is one of the perks that the soldiers who oversaw the crucifixion got, was that they got the prisoner's clothing, or the one to be executed's clothing, and that's why they they divided the clothes and cast lot for the one piece of garment that was too valuable to divide. So if we look now at verses 25 to 32, we see that according to Mark, Jesus was crucified in the third hour, which in our way of measuring time would be about 9 a.m. Third hour of daylight is what they're talking about, and so the sun would rise at 6, and therefore we're talking about 9 o'clock in the morning. There's an apparent contradiction in the Gospel of John, where in verse 18, 14, the trial before Pilate is still taking place during at noon. There's a couple of possible explanations for this. One is that they're mistaking a letter that represented the number 6 that looked like our English capital F, and the letter gamma, capital letter gamma, that looks like an upside down L, which stood for 3, and that this was a mistake of a copyist. Otherwise, it could have been a later insertion into Mark, or it could have also been just the fact that uh, in Jesus' day, time was far less specific, and so these times being general could fit within that time frame. Uh, the sign that would say the charge against Jesus read the King of the Jews. This is found in the Gospel of Mark. There's slight variations in all the Gospels, but all the Gospels talk about this sign. John lets us know that it was in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, and that could also be why there's slightly different versions in each of the Gospels, as they would have been potentially translating it from another language. But we see here that very clearly Jesus is being crucified because he is claiming to be the Messiah. And that continues as we look further into this. We see that Jesus was crucified with 2 robbers. The word may also have been an insurrectionist. That the word robber in Greek can also be translated that way. And in fact, that was the very first accusation of the very first written criticism of Jesus, is that he was an insurrectionist. This was stated by Cellius, a Greek philosopher and also one who wrote against the Christian faith in about late 2nd century. So we see in this very compressed account of Jesus' crucifixion that the words that are being said by the participants are saying much more than they realize. So the first thing that we hear is that people were saying, "Oh, you're going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. If you can do that, save yourself." The irony of that is that Jesus, when he made that statement, was talking about himself, and that, ironically enough, he could save himself, but he could not rebuild the temple. He could not save others if he chose to save himself. There would be no sacrificial death. There would be no forgiveness of sins. That is true as well when the chief priests and the teachers of the law say he saved others, but he can't save himself. Again, he did save others, and he was going to save the world, but he couldn't do that and save himself. And the last kind of comment that was made is that, let's see if this is the Christ. Have him come down off the cross so that we may believe in him. Well, again, Jesus was the Christ. Jesus is the Christ, but he could not come down off the cross and save them. And added to that, we're told that even those that were crucified with Jesus mocked him. And if the translation should read insurrectionists instead of robbers, there's a very good chance that these insurrectionists were actually involved in a crime with Barabbas, and that Jesus literally took his spot. But regardless of that, the reality is that why Jesus was being crucified, because he was labeled as one who was causing an insurrection against Rome. But they're all speaking the truth without knowing it. That that even though these words are meant um, to scorn and mock him, and when I think about these words and the challenge that they must have been to Jesus, knowing full well that he had the power to come off the cross, had the power to end his enemies if he wanted, but chose rather to endure this suffering. The verbal abuse that he has taken must have been very similar to the flogging, and that it wasn't just the biting words, it was the fact that these words cut deep. Um, the beginning of Gospel of John, it talks about Jesus coming to his own, but his own did not receive him. And this is certainly finding its fulfillment right here as Jesus is being crucified. The next thing we read and this is the death of Christ, now, which begins in verses 33 and goes to 41 of chapter 15 of Mark, that darkness covered the earth. And the earth here certainly means Judea, as in the chosen earth, uh, from noon until about 3 o'clock. No gospel records the cause, but all imply that it was from God, and that it is a sign of judgment, and potentially maybe also a covering, where Jesus suffering, the darkness veils some of his suffering. That's another possibility. But the only words that Mark records of Jesus saying on the cross, and to uh, we don't have time in this lesson to go into all of the other accounts, because they have each have their own aspects of the crucifixion to focus on. But of all the sayings of Jesus on the cross, Mark only mentions this one, and it's, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And again, it's pretty difficult for us to even begin to comprehend what it must have been like for the Son, who had been with the Father from before the beginning of the world in perfect fellowship with him, to become sin, as Paul says, for us, and experience that separation from himself, in that sense, from God, what that must have felt like. And that is what is being expressed in these words. But there are those standing nearby who mistook his cry, would have been probably in Aramaic, which would have been Eli, Eli, why, which is a word for God. They mistook it for um, him calling out to Elijah. Now, Elijah might have been one that he would have called out to, because Elijah was seen as the forerunner and promoter of the Messiah. It might also be because Elijah had never died, and so would have been available to answer the call. But in the midst of that, someone brought him wine on a stick. We know that from the Gospel of John that Jesus made it known that he was thirsty. And then after he took that drink, he took it not to alleviate the suffering. He took it to remove the dryness from his throat, because he had one more thing to say, and that was, "It is finished." And with that, he surrendered his spirit and died. The last part of this passage talks about what happened immediately after Jesus' death, and that was that the curtain in the temple was torn from the top to bottom. And you have to understand that has some pretty significant meaning, because uh, no human being would have been able to do that, to rip the curtain from the top to the bottom. If somebody in the temple had done it, it would have been from the bottom to the top, obviously. And so this had profound significance, opening up the Holy of Holies. It would have been the mark of a new era, that Jesus has made a way for us to approach God, but it would have also carried with it a sense of judgment as to the beginning of the end of the old covenant. And in the midst of this too, and at the same moment, while all of these other people had been mocking Jesus, there was a soldier. And as he recognized in Jesus' death a holy man, he said he was the Son of God. Here was the Son of God. Now, the soldier was impressed with the way he died, and this would have been a way of saying, here's a righteous man. But certainly Mark records these words because once again, he was saying more than he knows, that he was testifying to the truth of what had just happened. And we see this repeated over and over again in the suffering of Christ, that there is the words testify to the truth of what's happening, even though they might be empty, even though they might be meant sarcastically. The truth of the gospel is being proclaimed even in the midst of Jesus' death. And it's being witnessed as well, because there's women from Galilee who were watching from a distance. Three of them marked names: Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and potentially Jesus. It could be Mary's, this is Jesus' mother, because we know that Jesus definitely had a brother named James. We're not certain about this. And then Mary Magdalene and Salome. So these women were present. They witnessed the crucifixion. They did, of course, not join in any of the mocking, and would have been deeply grieved at the experience. And it's interesting that these women who are there are also going to be witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, as we'll see next week. So trust that this has been beneficial to you, and we will speak with you in the next lesson, the final lesson of the Gospel of Mark. Take care and God bless.